Hello, my name is Cole Murray. This is my presentation on The Other Slavery, the uncovered story of Indian enslavement in America. So starting with some background, early in this unit we noted David Weber's definition of a frontier being a zone of interaction where the culture of the invader and of the invaded contend with one another and with their physical environment to produce a dynamic that is unique to time and place. So the question is, how do you see Resenda's book contributing to Weber's definition of a frontier? Are the two men's views significantly different or very similar? What accounts for these differences or similarities? And my answer to this question, I would argue that their views of a frontier are very similar. That's because both men claim and show that newcomers contended with existing groups of people and with the physical environment to produce a dynamic unique to the time and place in which their books take place. My first example of this is the contention between the Spanish and the Apache Native Americans. This happens in Chapter 8, Missions, Presidios, and Slaves, where we learn about the Spanish treatment of the Apache. Resendiz talks about the horrors they wrought upon this group of Native Americans, who had unluckily drifted southward into the silver-bearing areas of northern Mexico that the Spanish were trying to control. That's found on page 178 of my electronic book. As conflicts arose, the Spanish responded by capturing and deporting many Apache to central and southern Mexico. The suffering was tremendous. In the book we read that soldiers had an incentive to give the prisoners as little food as possible in order to profit from the budget set aside for food. They also forced the Indians to walk for hours on end in order to wear them down and prevent any escape attempts. Terrible abuse arose from the fact that the majority of the prisoners were women and children and at the mercy of male soldiers. Page 178. This created a very unique and quite appalling dynamic between these two groups. Furthermore, those that weren't taken prisoner had other threats to deal with, like the spreading of deadly diseases. Smallpox killed many Apache people, and sometimes they ended their days with a priest at their bedside offering to baptize them and save their souls from eternal damnation. That's found on page 180. This adds an additional dynamic to the situation, and it's crazy to think that many Native Americans suffered pain or even death in the name of salvation by the Spaniards. So, to summarize my first example, the Spanish wanted to control the physical environment because of its resources, which in this case was silver. Contention between the existing group of Apache led to conflict which resulted in the capture, deportation, and suffering of the natives. I would argue that the Spanish used the physical environment to wear them down during this process, and that the spreading of deadly diseases was another way the Spanish were able to use the environment to inflict suffering on the Apache, whether or not they meant to. So in this first example between the Spanish and Apache, we've seen that the invaders did contend with the invaded and the physical environment to produce a dynamic unique to that time and place. My second example is the dynamic between the white frontiersmen, Hispanics, and the Navajo. In Chapter 11, A New Era of Indian Bondage, Resendiz really solidified Weber's definition of a frontier. The chapter title says it all, but the thing that struck me as an interesting interaction between the invader and the invaded was the Navajo raids carried out by a group of Hispanic volunteers in New Mexico. None of these raids was more successful than Ramon Baca's in November 1863 that took hundreds of prisoners who were sold as domestics all over the territory. That's found on page 240. So what made Ramon Baca and other Hispanic slavers so successful? The book claims it was by means of their superior knowledge of Indian hiding places. That's on page 240 as well. I would infer that after being there for hundreds of years, the Hispanic groups probably had a deep understanding and familiarity with the New Mexican region and landscape. This knowledge of the physical environment played a large role in their success. And now let's take a step back and ask ourselves where the motivation for these raids came from. other than the profit from selling slaves, who initiated the raids on the Navajo in the first place? The American government had a great interest in controlling New Mexico, but General Carleton was having trouble controlling the Navajo on his own. Carleton proposed a plan to raise volunteer forces in each county and launched what amounted to be full-scale slaving raids. That's on page 40 as well. So the slave raids were initiated and orchestrated by the white frontiersmen who invoked the power, knowledge, and pride of local Hispanics to take down the Navajo in New Mexico. And what were the results of the Navajo slave raids? The book says it was clear that by the summer of 1865, nearly all proprietaried New Mexicans, whether Hispanic or Anglo, held Indian slaves, primarily women and children of the Navajo Nation. The enslavement of Navajo in the 1860s was a direct result of the American conquest of the West. The federal government's policies of removal gave Indian slavers extraordinary opportunities to ply their trade. That's found on page 245. So to summarize my second example, just like in my first example, we see the Spanish, now Hispanic groups, raiding the Navajo in New Mexico. They used these raids to capture and sell hundreds of enslaved Navajo, using their expertise of the landscape and knowledge of the native hideouts. All of this was initiated by the white frontiersmen who worked under the federal government and its removal policies in order to control the West. In conclusion, we've seen examples of the invader and the invaded contending with one another and the physical environment to create a unique dynamic to the time and place. The Spanish removed the Apache by means of deportation in the late 1700s. The federal government and its frontiersmen manipulated existing groups of Hispanics, pitting them against the Navajo Nation, in order to take over the West in the 1860s. We've seen how the physical landscape, environment, and elements were exploited throughout each of these examples. Sometimes knowledge of the land aided in the capture of natives, and other times they used the dry heat or deadly diseases to wear down and kill the enemy. Overall, the physical environment played a key role as the driving force in the dynamic, as newcomers were always looking to control it. Resenda's book describes the frontier with the underlying theme of slavery, but these examples show, and I believe, that he and Weber's definition of a frontier remain very similar in their core. Both men concur that a frontier is a zone of interaction where the culture of the invader and of the invaded contend with one another and with their physical environment to produce a dynamic that is unique to time and place.